All right, folks, today we're diving deep into a movie that absolutely rocked an entire generation of comic book fans. A movie that, when it dropped back in 2007, had millions of people rushing to theaters to see one of Marvel's most iconic anti-heroes finally come to life on the big screen. I'm talking, of course, about Ghost Rider, the Spirit of Vengeance, that wild ride starring the one and only Nicolas Cage that brought us fire, burning skulls, hellish motorcycles, and a deal with the devil himself. And look, I know this movie splits people right down the middle. There are folks who love it with every fiber of their being, and there are folks who tear it apart. But what nobody can deny is that Ghost Rider has something special about it. It's got this energy that grabs you from the very first frame and doesn't let go until the credits roll. So buckle up, because we're going all in on everything that makes this movie so memorable. From the basic premise to the tiniest production details, covering the performances, the visual effects, the soundtrack, and a whole lot more. This is going to be a long ride, so get comfortable, grab your popcorn, and let's get into it. The core premise of Ghost Rider is something that sounds like it was pulled straight out of a gothic nightmare blended with a dark fairy tale, and that's precisely what makes it so captivating. Picture a young stunt motorcyclist named Johnny Blaze, a kid who literally lives life on the edge, pulling off impossible jumps on his bike in death-defying stunt shows. This guy has a relatively normal life, all things considered. He works with his dad in a motorcycle show, he's got a beautiful girlfriend, and the future seems to be smiling at him. But then comes the moment that changes everything, the moment that defines his entire existence forever. His father is sick, seriously sick with cancer, and Johnny would do anything to save him. And when I say anything, I mean literally anything, including cutting a deal with the devil. Because that's exactly what happens. Mephistopheles, the Lord of Darkness, the big boss of the underworld, shows up in front of Johnny and offers him a deal that seems too good to be true. And you know what they say? When something seems too good to be true, it probably is. The deal is simple on the surface, but devastating in its consequences. Mephistopheles will cure his father's cancer in exchange for Johnny's soul. And Johnny, desperate, young, and impulsive, accepts. He signs the contract with a drop of his own blood and seals his fate. Now here's where things get really interesting and tragic at the same time, because Mephistopheles holds up his end of the bargain, but he does it in the most twisted way imaginable. Yeah, he cures Johnny's father's cancer, but the very next day his father dies in a motorcycle accident during one of their shows. Technically, Mephistopheles didn't lie. He cured the cancer, but he never promised Johnny's father would live forever. It's that classic devilish trick, the kind of trap you find in old legends about demonic pacts, where words carry their literal meaning and the devil always finds a way to come out on top. This moment is absolutely devastating for Johnny. He doesn't just lose his father. He realizes he sold his soul for nothing, that he got played by the most cunning creature in the universe. And that guilt, that rage, that feeling of being betrayed in the worst possible way is what defines the character for the rest of the film. But the story doesn't end there, of course not, because years later, when Johnny Blaze has become a famous stunt motorcyclist known for pulling off the most dangerous and insane stunts anyone has ever seen, Mephistopheles comes back to collect on his debt. And he's not just here to take Johnny's soul. No, sir, he's got a job for him. Turns out Mephistopheles' son, a charming fellow named Blackheart, has rebelled against his father and is hunting for an ancient contract containing 1,000 corrupt souls, a contract that would give him immense power, enough to dethrone Mephistopheles and conquer both hell and earth. So Mephistopheles transforms Johnny into the Ghost Rider, a being with a skull engulfed in flames, a Hellfire motorcycle, and the power to punish the wicked with the penance stare, which forces sinners to feel every ounce of pain they've ever inflicted on others. Johnny has to stop Blackheart and recover the contract, and in return, Mephistopheles promises to free his soul. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. Trusting another promise from the devil doesn't exactly seem like the smartest move in the world. And you'd be absolutely right. Now let's talk about the main characters, because this movie has a cast of characters that, while not huge in number, are each well-defined in their own way. Let's start with the absolute lead, Johnny Blaze, played by Nicolas Cage. Johnny is a complex guy, way more complex than he might seem at first glance. On the outside, he's this fearless daredevil who seems afraid of nothing, pulling off impossible jumps and cheating death every time he gets on his bike. But on the inside, he's a tormented man, a guy carrying immense guilt over his father's death who lives with the constant terror of knowing his soul doesn't belong to him. There's a fascinating duality in Johnny Blaze. During the day, he's this charismatic and somewhat eccentric guy who listens to Carpenter's music and eats jelly beans to calm his nerves, and at night he transforms into this infernal creature that punishes the wicked with fire and chains. It's like having two completely different personalities coexisting in the same body, and that tension between the man and the monster is what makes the character so compelling to watch. And look, I gotta say it, Nicolas Cage was a perfect choice for this role, and I know a lot of people won't agree with me on that, but hear me out. Nicolas Cage has something that very few actors possess, an innate ability to convey extreme intensity and vulnerability at the same time. When you watch Cage as Johnny Blaze, you believe him when he's scared, you believe him when he's angry, you believe him when he's desperate. Sure, Cage has his particular acting style that can sometimes come across as over the top. But for a character like Ghost Rider, that amped-up energy works perfectly. We're talking about a guy who transforms into a flaming skull here. This isn't some intimate character drama. It needs that unbridled energy, that almost manic intensity that Cage handles like nobody else. Plus, Cage is a self-proclaimed comic book fanatic. Ghost Rider was one of his favorite characters since he was a kid. So there's a genuine passion behind his performance that shows in every single scene. Then we've got Roxanne Simpson, played by Eva Mendes, who serves as Johnny's love interest and a character who carries more weight in the story than most people give her credit for. Roxanne isn't just the pretty girl who's there to look good, though Eva Mendes certainly delivers on that front too. Roxanne is an ambitious and intelligent journalist who has her own career and her own goals in life. She and Johnny have history. They were teenage sweethearts, but split up when Johnny vanished from her life without any explanation after his father's death. Years later, they reconnect, and the chemistry between them is still very much alive, but Johnny's carrying this enormous secret he can't share with her, and that tension between wanting to be with the person you love and knowing your life is literally cursed creates some really effective dramatic moments throughout the film. The truth is, The relationship between Johnny and Roxanne works as the emotional anchor for the entire story. Without that human connection, without that love Johnny feels for Roxanne, the movie would just be a string of action sequences featuring a flaming skull, which honestly wouldn't be terrible either, let's be real, but it wouldn't have the emotional depth needed for us to actually care about what happens to the main character. Roxanne represents everything good that Johnny could have in his life. If he weren't chained to that infernal pact, she's his motivation to fight, his reason to try to break free from the curse, and ultimately, she's his connection to whatever humanity he still has inside despite becoming a demonic avenger. Eva Mendes does a solid job with the role, bringing warmth and believability to a character that in someone else's hands could have easily felt one-dimensional. There are moments where Roxanne shows genuine strength of character, especially when she discovers the truth about Johnny and decides to stand by his side despite everything. She doesn't run off screaming like plenty of female characters in these kinds of movies would. Instead, she faces the situation with courage and determination. That gives the character an added dimension that I really appreciate. Now let's move on to the movie's primary antagonist, and when I say primary, I mean the one actually causing trouble in the plot, which isn't Mephistopheles, but rather his son Blackheart. Blackheart is played by Wes Bentley, and he's a villain who generates some pretty divided opinions among fans. The comic book version of Blackheart is a monstrous creature, a demonic entity that inspires terror just by being in the room. In the movie, Blackheart spends most of his time in human form, appearing as a pale, elegant young man with an unsettling smile and an arrogant attitude that'll make your skin crawl. Wes Bentley gives the character an air of restrained menace, like a predator toying with its prey before going in for the kill. He's not the most terrifying villain you'll ever see in a superhero movie, but he has his moments, particularly when he's interacting with his henchmen or threatening Roxanne to provoke Johnny. Blackheart has a clear and understandable motivation. He wants to surpass his father. It's the classic generational conflict taken to the extreme. A son who wants to prove he's more powerful and more capable than his old man, even if it means tearing everything apart in the process. Blackheart is after the contract of San Venganza, a document containing the souls of 1,000 evil people who lived in an old western town. If Blackheart gets those souls, his power skyrockets, and he can challenge Mephistopheles for control of hell. It's a premise that works within the movie's context and gives the story a race against time urgency that keeps things tense throughout the second and third acts. What Blackheart is hunting for, or rather what he's desperately searching for throughout the entire film, is precisely that contract, the contract of San Venganza. This contract is hidden away in a ghost town called San Venganza, a place that was abandoned over a century ago when the original Ghost Rider refused to deliver the souls to the devil. And this is where another fascinating character enters the picture, the caretaker, masterfully portrayed by Sam Elliott. But we'll get to him in a moment, because first I want to talk about Blackheart's henchmen, who are a really interesting visual element of the movie. Blackheart doesn't come alone. He brings along 3 elemental demons who in the comics are known as the Hidden. In the movie, they're Gressel, an earth demon, Abagor, a wind demon, and Wallow, a water demon. Each of these demons has powers tied to their element, and they provide some of the most spectacular action sequences in the entire film. Ghost Rider's fight against each of them is an opportunity to showcase the spirit of vengeance's powers in different ways and different settings, which keeps the action sequences feeling fresh and varied instead of repetitive. Gressel, the Earth Demon, has the ability to decompose and rot everything he touches. Essentially, he's the embodiment of decay and organic destruction. His fight with Ghost Rider takes place in a swampy area, and it's visually very distinctive because everything around him withers and dies. Abagor, the Wind Demon, can transform into air and move at incredible speeds, making him a difficult opponent to catch. His showdown with Ghost Rider includes a really thrilling aerial pursuit. And Wallow, the Water Demon, can turn his body into liquid and manipulate water at will, which leads to a fight set in an aquatic environment that's one of the most creative in the entire movie. What's cool about these three demons is that they're not just faceless thugs. Each one has their own attitude and their own approach to fighting Ghost Rider. Gressel is brutal and direct. Abagor is cunning and evasive. And Wallow is sneaky and deceptive. Together, they form a team that represents a real threat to the spirit of vengeance and forces him to use different strategies and abilities to defeat each one. It's a classic narrative structure, the hero who has to overcome a series of trials before facing the final boss, and it works really well in this movie's context because every fight is a chance to explore Ghost Rider's powers and limitations. All right, now let's talk about the Caretaker, because this character is one of the best things about the entire movie, and Sam Elliott does an absolutely phenomenal job bringing him to life. The Caretaker is a mysterious old cowboy who seems to know way more than he lets on, and when you first see him, you think he's just some eccentric cemetery groundskeeper who speaks in riddles and gives cryptic advice. But as the movie progresses, you realize there's a whole lot more behind that cowboy hat and that gravelly voice. The Caretaker knows the history of the Ghost Rider. He knows about the contract of San Venganza, and he has crucial information that Johnny needs to survive and complete his mission. Sam Elliott is one of those actors who has a natural screen presence that very few can match. With his signature mustache, his deep voice, and his authentic cowboy bearing, Elliott gives the Caretaker a credibility and a gravitas that elevates every scene he's in. When the Caretaker speaks, you listen, not because he's yelling or making a scene, but because there's a natural authority in his voice and in the way he carries himself that tells you this man has seen things you can't even begin to imagine. And the relationship he develops with Johnny is one of the most interesting dynamics in the movie. He functions as a kind of mentor, a guide who helps Johnny understand his new nature and find the strength to face Blackheart. And here comes one of the most satisfying reveals in the whole movie. So if for some reason you still haven't seen it and don't want spoilers, well, you've been listening to me go on for quite a while now, so you're probably in too deep to turn back. The Caretaker turns out to be Carter Slade, the original Ghost Rider, the Phantom Rider who a century ago refused to hand over the contract of San Venganza to Mephistopheles and disappeared with it. Carter Slade was the spirit of vengeance before Johnny Blaze, but instead of a motorcycle, he had a horse, because we're talking about the Old West, and Harley-Davidsons weren't exactly a thing yet. This reveal is wonderful, because It explains why the caretaker knows so much about the Ghost Rider curse, why he has the contract hidden away, and why he's so invested in helping Johnny. He's been waiting for over 100 years for someone strong enough to come along and do what he couldn't: destroy the contract and defeat the demons. And the scene where Carter Slade transforms into the Old West Ghost Rider and rides alongside Johnny to San Venganza is, without exaggeration, one of the most epic scenes in the entire film. Watching the two Ghost Riders riding together, one on a motorcycle wrapped in flames and the other on a skeletal horse surrounded by fire, with Christopher Young's score swelling in the background, is a moment that gives you chills. Sam Elliott at his finest, Nicolas Cage at his finest. Two generations of spirits of vengeance united in a common mission. It's the kind of scene that makes you want to stand up and clap in the theater. Let's talk now about Mephistopheles, played by Peter Fonda, because this character deserves his own deep dive. Peter Fonda, for those who don't know, is a cinema legend, especially famous for Easy Rider, a 1969 movie about bikers that became a counterculture icon. The fact that Fonda plays the devil in a movie about a phantom biker is a brilliant nod to his career and to biker culture in general. There's something deliciously ironic about seeing the star of Easy Rider cast as the villain in a movie about another motorcycle rider. And I'm certain the filmmakers were very much aware of that irony when they brought him on board. Peter Fonda plays Mephistopheles with an elegance and a calm that turns out to be far more terrifying than any shouting or direct threats ever could be. His Mephistopheles is an old-world Southern gentleman, polished and courteous on the surface, but absolutely ruthless underneath. When he speaks to Johnny, he does so with a kind smile and an almost fatherly tone, as if he genuinely cares about him. But you know that behind that facade is an ancient creature who doesn't have the slightest regard for human life. Fonda captures that duality perfectly, that ability of the devil to seem like your best friend while he's stealing your soul. He's not a villain who inspires hatred. He's a villain who inspires a deep, creeping fear, because you know he's smarter than you, and he always has a plan behind his plan. The dynamic between Mephistopheles and Blackheart is also fascinating because it mirrors a deeply dysfunctional father-son relationship. Mephistopheles sees his son as a potential threat, not as an heir, and Blackheart sees his father as an obstacle to overcome, not as a role model. It's an infernal version of the generational conflict we all experience at some point in our lives, except instead of arguing about who's going to do the dishes, these two are fighting over control of hell itself. And Johnny Blaze gets caught right in the middle of this demonic family feud, being used as a pawn by both sides. I want to talk now about a character who often gets overlooked, but who holds significant importance in the story, and that's Barton Blaze, Johnny's father, played by Brett Cullen. Barton only appears in the early scenes of the movie during the flashback showing Johnny's youth, but his presence echoes throughout the entire story. Barton is a stunt motorcyclist who works a small traveling show, a tough, hard-working guy who loves his son, but also constantly puts him in danger by including him in increasingly risky stunts. When Barton gets diagnosed with cancer, we see Johnny's desperation, and we understand why a teenager would do something as extreme as selling his soul. Barton's death is the emotional engine driving the whole movie. Everything Johnny does, Every decision he makes, every battle he fights, is motivated by the guilt and pain of losing his father that way. Johnny doesn't just feel guilty about making the deal with the devil, he also carries the burden of having been, in a sense, the cause of his father's death. If he hadn't sold his soul, Mephistopheles would have had no reason to intervene in the Blaze family's life, and maybe the cancer would have played out differently. It's a vicious cycle of guilt and regret that turns Johnny into a far more tragic character than he appears on the surface. Also worth mentioning is young Johnny Blaze, played by Matt Long, who appears in the flashback scenes. Matt Long does an excellent job capturing the innocence and impulsiveness of a teenage Johnny who hasn't yet been marked by tragedy. There's a lightness to his performance that contrasts beautifully with the heaviness and darkness of Nicolas Cage's adult Johnny, and the young Roxanne, played by Raquel Alessi, also deserves credit for laying the groundwork of the love story that becomes so important to the main plot. Now, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the creative team behind the movie, because understanding who made this film and how they made it helps us appreciate it from a more complete perspective. Ghost Rider was directed by Mark Steven Johnson, a filmmaker who already had experience in the world of Marvel comic adaptations, having directed Daredevil back in 2003. Johnson didn't just direct Ghost Rider, he also wrote the screenplay, which means he had pretty significant creative control over the movie's vision. And Johnson was a genuine fan of the character. He knew the comics inside and out, and had a real passion for bringing the spirit of vengeance to the big screen in a way that honored the source material. Writing the screenplay for Ghost Rider was no easy task, because the character has a fairly complex mythology that includes elements of supernatural horror, superhero action, Western drama, and romance. Johnson had to find a way to weave all these elements into a coherent story that would work for comic book fans and general audiences who might never have heard of Ghost Rider alike. And I think, overall, he did a pretty solid job. The story has a clear beginning, middle, and end. The characters are well established with understandable motivations, and there are enough twists and surprises to keep the viewer engaged throughout. Sure, the script isn't perfect, no script ever is, and there are moments where the dialogue feels a bit forced or where the transitions between scenes aren't as smooth as they could be. But Johnson does a good job managing the movie's tone, which is a delicate balancing act between dark and fun, between horror and humor. There are genuinely funny moments in the movie, like the scenes where Johnny tries to explain his situation to Roxanne, or the reactions of people seeing Ghost Rider for the first time. And these lighter beats are necessary to balance out the darker, more violent sequences. The movie was produced by Columbia Pictures, which at the time was part of Sony Pictures Entertainment, and it hit theaters in February 2007. The main producers were Avi Arad, Stephen Paul, and Michael DeLuca. Avi Arad is a hugely important figure in the history of Marvel superhero cinema. He served as president of Marvel Studios for many years and was behind many of the Marvel movie adaptations of that era, including Spider-Man, X-Men, and Hulk. His involvement in Ghost Rider gave the movie a direct connection to the Marvel production universe and ensured there was a baseline respect for the original comic material. Stephen Paul is a producer with a long Hollywood career spanning a variety of genres, and Michael DeLuca is known for having served as president of production at New Line Cinema and for his involvement in films like Austin Powers' Blade and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. With this team of experienced producers backing it, Ghost Rider had solid support both in terms of financing and industry expertise. The journey of how Ghost Rider made it to the big screen is actually a long and interesting one, because the project was in development for years before it finally materialized. The film rights to the Ghost Rider character were first acquired back in the 1990s, and for years there were several attempts to make a movie that never came together. At one point, there was consideration of making a darker, horror-oriented film, but when Marvel started finding success with their superhero adaptations in the early 2000s, the decision was made that Ghost Rider should follow a similar formula, combining action, humor, and visual spectacle. Nicolas Cage was attached to the project for a long time, and in fact, he was one of the driving forces behind getting it made. As I already mentioned, Cage is a lifelong comic book fan. He even has a Ghost Rider tattoo that had to be covered with makeup during filming. His passion for the character is what kept the project alive during those years of development, and when production finally got the green light, Cage was ready and committed 100%. There's a famous story about Cage buying a Ghost Rider comic that cost a fortune, and considering it one of his most prized possessions, that's how much he loved this character. The inspiration for the movie came from various sources within the extensive Ghost Rider comic book universe. The character of Johnny Blaze was created by Roy Thomas, Gary Friedrich, and Mike Ploog, and first appeared in Marvel Spotlight number 5 in August 1972. Since then, Ghost Rider has had multiple incarnations and comic book series, and the movie draws from several of these versions to create its own interpretation of the character. The idea of the Devil's Pact, the transformation into a flaming skull, the chain as a weapon, and the Hellfire motorcycle are all elements pulled directly from the comics, and Johnson integrates them effectively into his cinematic narrative. What's also interesting is how the movie incorporates Western genre elements, particularly through the character of Carter Slade and the story of the Contract of San Venganza. The Old West has always been fertile ground for supernatural storytelling, from legends of ghost towns to tales of gunslingers making pacts with dark forces. Ghost Rider taps into that tradition and blends it with the modern aesthetic of motorcycle culture, creating a unique fusion that gives the movie a very distinctive visual and narrative identity. But anyway, let's talk about the full cast, because there are several actors we haven't covered yet who deserve recognition. In addition to Nicolas Cage, Eva Mendes, Wes Bentley, Sam Elliott, and Peter Fonda, the movie features Donald Logue as Mac, Johnny's best friend and co-worker. Mac serves as the comic relief of the movie, and Donald Logue plays him with a natural charisma that makes every one of his scenes fun and enjoyable. Mac is the guy who's always there for Johnny, the loyal friend who doesn't fully understand what's happening to him, but never abandons him. He's a character who could have been forgettable with a different actor, but Logue gives him such a likable personality that you find yourself grinning every time he pops up on screen. There's a particularly memorable scene where Mac witnesses Johnny's transformation into Ghost Rider, and his reaction is absolutely priceless. Instead of running away screaming like any normal person would, Mac just stands there with this mix of terror and fascination that's pitch perfect. It's the kind of moment that relieves tension without breaking the movie's atmosphere, and that's a credit to both the writing and Logue's performance. We also have David Roberts as Captain Mackey, a police officer investigating the supernatural events surrounding Ghost Rider's appearance. Mackey is a secondary but functional character who represents the perspective of law and order in the face of the supernatural and serves as a reminder that Ghost Rider's actions have real-world consequences. The chemistry between the principal actors is something worth examining because it's fundamental to making the movie work on an emotional level. The chemistry between Nicolas Cage and Eva Mendes as Johnny and Roxanne is believable and tender. You can tell both actors put in the effort to create an authentic connection between their characters. There's a scene at a restaurant where Johnny and Roxanne have their first date as adults that's genuinely charming, with Johnny being nervous and awkward and Roxanne being amused and slightly exasperated. It's the kind of scene that reminds you that behind all the supernatural spectacle, there's a human love story that's relatable and real. The chemistry between Cage and Sam Elliott is also excellent, but in a completely different way. There's no romance here, just mutual respect and understanding between two men who share a curse. When the caretaker and Johnny talk, there's a weight to their conversations that contrasts with the humor and lightness of other scenes. Elliott has such a commanding presence that he elevates every scene he's in, and Cage, who can sometimes lean a bit heavy on the theatrics, dials it back and centers himself when he's opposite Elliott, as if he knows he needs to rise to his scene partner's level. And then there's the dynamic between Cage and Wes Bentley as Johnny and Blackheart, which operates differently from the other relationships in the film. There's no positive chemistry here, but rather an antagonistic tension that keeps every confrontation between them charged with energy. Bentley plays Blackheart with a cold, calculating demeanor that contrasts with Cage's emotional intensity, and that difference in acting styles creates a visual and dramatic contrast that makes their scenes together the most tense in the movie. Now let's dive deeper into the plot and its twists, because Ghost Rider has some key revelations and pivotal moments that deserve close examination. The movie's structure follows a fairly classic narrative arc, divided into three clearly defined acts. The first act establishes the world, the characters, and the central conflict. The second act develops Johnny's transformation and his early encounters with the forces of evil. And the third act brings everything to a climax in the ghost town of San Venganza. One of the most interesting aspects of the plot is the nature of the pact between Johnny and Mephistopheles. When Johnny signs the contract, he doesn't really know what he's getting into. He thinks he's selling his soul in exchange for his father's life, but what he's actually agreeing to is becoming an instrument of the devil, a supernatural servant who can be summoned at any time to do Mephistopheles' dirty work. This distinction is important because it establishes that Johnny doesn't truly have free will when it comes to his transformation into Ghost Rider. He doesn't choose when to transform. He doesn't choose who to attack, and he can't control his actions while in his spirit of vengeance form, at least not initially. And this is where the movie introduces one of its most powerful themes, the fight for control over your own soul. Throughout the story, Johnny gradually learns to control the Ghost Rider curse, to wield his powers according to his own will instead of being Mephistopheles' puppet. This process of empowerment is fundamentally a metaphor for personal autonomy and the ability to choose your own destiny even when circumstances seem completely stacked against you. Johnny didn't ask to be Ghost Rider. He doesn't want to be Ghost Rider, but instead of giving up and accepting his fate, he fights to turn the curse into something he can use for good. The movie's most important turning point happens at the climax, when Johnny faces Blackheart in San Venganza. Blackheart has managed to get the contract of San Venganza and has absorbed the 1,000 souls it contained, transforming himself into an enormously powerful creature calling himself Legion. At this point, Ghost Rider seems completely outmatched. Legion is stronger, faster, and seemingly invulnerable. But Johnny finds a way to beat him using the penance stare, Ghost Rider's power to make sinners feel all the pain they've caused. At first, it seems like the stare won't work on Blackheart because, as a demon, he doesn't have a human soul that can be judged. But now that Blackheart has absorbed 1,000 human souls, all of them sinful, the penance stare has 1,000 souls to work on, and the result is devastating for Blackheart. It's a brilliant narrative turn because it uses the villain's own arrogance against him. Blackheart thought absorbing those souls would make him invincible, but it actually made him more vulnerable to Ghost Rider's specific power. It's the kind of poetic irony that works perfectly in a story about deals with the devil and supernatural justice. Blackheart's greed was his undoing, and that's a theme as old as humanity itself. After defeating Blackheart, Johnny faces Mephistopheles, who comes to fulfill his promise of freeing Johnny's soul in exchange for having stopped his son. And here's where Johnny does something completely unexpected. He rejects Mephistopheles' offer. Instead of handing over the Ghost Rider curse and getting his soul back, Johnny decides to keep the power. He tells Mephistopheles he'll use the curse against him, that he'll become the devil's worst nightmare, that Ghost Rider will no longer be an instrument of evil, but a weapon for good. It's an incredibly satisfying moment because it represents the culmination of Johnny's arc, going from being a passive victim of fate to being an active agent in his own story. Mephistopheles, furious at Johnny's defiance, warns him that he'll make him pay for his insolence. But he can't do anything about it in that moment because Johnny has the Ghost Rider's power and has claimed it as his own. It's an open-ended finale that clearly sets up the possibility of a sequel, which did indeed happen with Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance in 2012. But that's a whole other conversation for another day. What I find particularly effective about this ending is that it's not a conventional happy ending. Johnny doesn't break free of the curse, he doesn't get his soul back, and his life doesn't return to normal. Instead, he accepts his situation and decides to make the best of it. It's a type of heroism that strikes me as more real and more admirable than the hero who defeats the villain and lives happily ever after. Johnny chooses to carry an enormous burden, not out of obligation, but out of his own free will, and that's what makes him a genuine hero in the deepest sense of the word. Let's talk now about the technical aspects of the movie, because Ghost Rider has some production elements that deserve recognition and detailed analysis. Starting with the visual effects, which are probably the most eye-catching aspect of the entire production. Back in 2007, Creating a convincing flaming skull in CGI was a considerable technical challenge, and the movie's visual effects team, led by Kevin Mack at Digital Domain, along with other studios like Sony Pictures Imageworks, delivered work that by the standards of the time was pretty impressive. The design of Ghost Rider himself is a piece of digital artistry. The skull has detailed bone texture visible through the flames. The eyes are hollow sockets glowing with an internal fire, and the flames surrounding the head behave organically, changing depending on the character's emotional state. When Ghost Rider is calm, the flames are more contained and controlled. When he's enraged, they explode upward and intensify dramatically. This level of detail in the flame animation gives the character a surprising amount of expressiveness, considering he has no face, no eyebrows to raise, no mouth to open, just fire and bone. And yet you can read Ghost Rider's emotions with remarkable clarity. Ghost Rider's motorcycle, known as the Hell Cycle, is another notable visual achievement. When Johnny transforms, his motorcycle transforms too, going from a relatively normal chopper to an infernal machine with wheels of fire, a chassis that looks like it's made of molten metal, and chains wrapping around the frame. The Hell Cycle leaves a trail of fire wherever it goes, scorches the asphalt, and can climb up building walls in complete defiance of gravity. The chase sequences with the Hell Cycle are some of the most exciting in the movie, especially the first chase through city streets when Johnny has just transformed and still doesn't have full control of his powers. There's an iconic scene where Ghost Rider rides his motorcycle vertically up the side of a skyscraper, and that image became one of the movie's most memorable moments, used extensively in the promotional materials. Visually, it's spectacular. Watching this flaming skull climbing up a building on his bike while windows shatter and metal melts in his wake is the kind of image that burns itself into your memory. The movie's visual style is interesting because it tries to blend elements from different genres. The daytime scenes have a luminous, warm quality reminiscent of Western films, especially when the action takes place in the deserts and highways of the American Southwest. The nighttime scenes, on the other hand, are dark and atmospheric, with a color palette dominated by deep blues, pitch blacks, and the burning oranges of Ghost Rider's fire. This visual contrast between day and night mirrors the duality of the main character, Johnny Blaze by day, Ghost Rider by night. The cinematography was handled by Russell Boyd, an Australian director of photography who has worked on films like Gallipoli, Master and Commander, and Picnic at Hanging Rock. Boyd has a special talent for capturing vast, open landscapes with an almost painterly quality, and this skill is put to full use in Ghost Rider. The shots of the American desert, the long, lonely highways, the small, dusty towns, all have a visual beauty that gives the movie a sense of scale and place that's essential to the story. Boyd also does excellent work with the lighting, especially in the nighttime scenes where Ghost Rider's fire serves as the primary light source. There's a very effective technique used throughout the film where Ghost Rider's flames illuminate the surroundings in a way that creates dramatic shadows and stark visual contrast. When Ghost Rider walks down a dark alley, for instance, the flames from his head cast elongated, shifting shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that's simultaneously terrifying and mesmerizing. It's the kind of lighting that calls back to classic horror films, where light and shadow are just as important as the actors and the script. The use of color throughout the movie also warrants attention. Mark Steven Johnson and Russell Boyd make deliberate use of warm versus cool color contrast to reinforce the story's themes. Warm colors, primarily the oranges and reds of fire, are associated with Ghost Rider and supernatural power. Cool colors, the blues and grays, are associated with the normal world and Johnny's vulnerability in his human form. When these two color schemes collide in the same scene, like when Ghost Rider appears in the middle of a cold night, the visual result is striking and gorgeous. There's also an interesting use of dark greens and blacks in the scenes involving Blackheart, giving the villain his own visual identity that sets him apart from both Ghost Rider and the normal world. Every time Blackheart enters a scene, the color palette subtly shifts toward darker, colder tones, creating a feeling of oppression and menace that complements Wes Bentley's performance. In terms of runtime, the movie clocks in at approximately 110 minutes. That's an hour and 50 minutes, which is a pretty standard length for a superhero action movie. It's neither too short to feel rushed nor too long to lose the viewer's interest. Johnson manages the movie's pacing well, alternating between intense action sequences and quieter moments of character development and plot advancement that let the audience connect emotionally with the story without getting bored during the calmer stretches. There are a couple of spots in the second act where the pace dips a bit more than necessary, but overall the film moves at a speed that holds your attention without exhausting you. Now let's talk about the soundtrack, because Christopher Young, the composer, did a fantastic job crafting a score that perfectly complements the movie's tone and atmosphere. Young is known for his work on horror films like Hellraiser and Sinister, and that expertise shows in the Ghost Rider score. The music has a dark, epic quality that evokes both supernatural horror and the heroic grandeur of the character. There are themes that are sinister and threatening, themes that are heroic and triumphant, and themes that are emotional and melancholic, and Young weaves them together in a way that reinforces every emotional beat of the film. The main Ghost Rider theme is particularly memorable, a piece that combines epic choirs with distorted electric guitars and heavy percussion. It's the kind of theme that makes you want to jump on a motorcycle and ride down a desert highway with the wind in your face, which I suppose is exactly what the filmmakers were going for. And when that theme kicks in during the action scenes, the combination of music and visuals creates a sensory impact that's hard to forget. Beyond the original score, the movie features several rock and country songs that complement the biker aesthetic of the story. There are tracks from Spiderbait, Ghost Riders in the Sky, and other songs that fit perfectly into the world of Johnny Blaze and his culture of motorcyclists and stunt shows. Ghost Riders in the Sky, in particular, is a perfect choice for this film, not just because of the obvious title connection, but because its lyrics describe spectral riders thundering across the sky, which is basically a description of Ghost Rider himself. Let's talk now about the movie's reception, because Ghost Rider got a mixed response that's interesting to break down. In terms of box office, the movie was an undeniable commercial hit. It opened in February 2007 and raked in over $228 million worldwide against a production budget of roughly $110 million. It was the #1 movie its opening weekend, with $45 million in the United States alone, proving there was a significant audience for the character and that the marketing campaign had done its job. Ghost Rider's commercial success was particularly noteworthy because the character wasn't nearly as well known as Spider-Man or the X-Men among mainstream audiences. A lot of people who went to see the movie had probably never read a Ghost Rider comic in their lives, but the premise was so visually appealing, a dude with a flaming skull riding a Hellfire motorcycle, that it was enough to draw millions of moviegoers to theaters. The marketing campaign was very effective in this regard. The trailers and posters showcased such striking imagery that it was hard not to be curious about seeing the film. However, the critical reception was considerably less enthusiastic. The movie sits at around 26% on Rotten Tomatoes, indicating that the majority of critics weren't impressed. The main criticisms centered on the script, which many found formulaic and predictable, and the movie's tone, which some critics felt didn't strike the right balance between serious and comedic. Some reviewers also took issue with the special effects being excessive and Nicolas Cage's performance being too over the top in certain moments. But here's where it gets interesting, because the audience reception was significantly more positive than the critics. The audience score on Rotten Tomatoes is notably higher than the critics' rating, and the movie has developed a considerable cult following over the years. Many fans champion the film as an entertaining and faithful representation of the comic book character and appreciate its unbridled energy and its willingness to be a pure entertainment experience without artistic pretensions. And I think that's the key to understanding Ghost Rider's reception. Critics judged it by the same standards they'd apply to a drama or a sophisticated thriller, and from that perspective, sure, Ghost Rider has obvious weaknesses. But if you look at it for what it actually is, a supernatural action movie based on a comic book designed to entertain and deliver a thrilling visual spectacle, then Ghost Rider accomplishes its mission and then some. Not every movie needs to be a cinematic masterpiece to be valuable and enjoyable, and Ghost Rider is the perfect example of a film that knows exactly what it is and does it with genuine enthusiasm. Now, let's dig deeper into the movie's specific strengths, because it has several that often get overlooked in discussions about its merit. The first and most obvious strength is its premise. The idea of a motorcyclist who makes a pact with the devil and becomes a supernatural avenger is inherently compelling and rich with narrative possibilities. It's the kind of premise that grabs your attention immediately and gives you enough material to build an exciting story. And the movie takes advantage of this premise effectively. It doesn't waste it or overcomplicate it, but develops it in a way that's satisfying both narratively and visually. Another important strength is the cast. We've already talked extensively about the individual performances, but it's worth reiterating that this is a high-quality ensemble that lends credibility to a story that could easily have been ridiculous with less talented actors. Nicolas Cage brings an intensity and passion to the role that's infectious. Sam Elliott provides gravity and authority. Peter Fonda is an elegant and frightening villain, and Eva Mendes adds warmth and humanity. Every actor understands the movie's tone and commits fully to their role, which is essential for the audience to take the story seriously, despite its more fantastical elements. The visual effects, as I've already discussed, are another significant strength. For 2007, the depiction of Ghost Rider was technically impressive and visually unforgettable. The flaming skull, the Hellfire motorcycle, the supernatural powers, everything is realized with a level of detail and creativity that demonstrates the talent and dedication of the special effects team. And there are moments, like Ghost Rider scaling the skyscraper or the final ride of the two Ghost Riders toward San Venganza, that are genuinely spectacular and justify the price of admission all on their own. The music is also a strength, as we've covered. Christopher Young's score is evocative and emotionally resonant, and the songs chosen for the soundtrack perfectly complement the movie's aesthetic. Music is one of those elements that often goes unnoticed when it works well, but is immediately apparent when it doesn't. And in Ghost Rider, the music works exceptionally well, adding layers of emotion and atmosphere to every scene. And finally, the movie has a sense of fun that's refreshing and welcome. Ghost Rider doesn't take itself too seriously. It knows when to be dramatic and when to be entertaining, and that ability to balance tone is what makes it such an enjoyable watch. There's a lightness in the way the movie approaches even its darkest moments that lets you enjoy the ride without feeling weighed down by the gravity of the situation. It's pure entertainment, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Now, let's be fair and also discuss the movie's weaknesses, because no analysis is complete without an honest examination of the things that don't work as well. The most frequently cited weakness is the screenplay, which, despite having a strong premise and interesting characters, sometimes falls into cliches and dialogue that sounds forced. There are moments where the characters say things that nobody would say in real life, even accounting for the fact that this is a movie about a flaming skeleton riding a motorcycle. The dialogue between Johnny and Roxanne, for example, sometimes feels too written, too perfectly structured to sound natural, and that can pull you out of the story momentarily. Another weakness is the development of certain secondary characters, particularly Blackheart and his demonic henchman. Blackheart has a clear motivation, but lacks the depth that would make him a truly memorable villain. We know he wants to surpass his father and conquer hell, but we don't know much more about him as a character. What does he think about humanity? What are his values, if he even has any? What kind of world does he want to create if he succeeds? These are questions the movie doesn't take the time to answer, and that makes Blackheart feel a bit flat compared to the protagonists. The demonic henchmen are even more one-dimensional, essentially serving as supernatural muscle that exists solely to give Ghost Rider someone to fight before the final showdown. They don't have individual personalities beyond their elemental powers, and their fights with Ghost Rider, while visually appealing, lack the emotional weight they would carry if we cared about these characters as individuals. It's a common problem in action movies, and Ghost Rider is no exception. There's also a pacing issue in the movie's second act. After the initial excitement of Johnny's transformation and his early adventures as Ghost Rider, there's a stretch where the film slows down a bit as Johnny tries to understand his powers and find a way to break the curse. These scenes are necessary for character development, but they could have been handled more dynamically to maintain narrative momentum. There are moments in the second act where you feel the movie is treading water instead of pushing forward, and that can test the patience of viewers who came in expecting non-stop action. And finally, it should be noted that the special effects while impressive for their time, haven't aged quite as gracefully as those in some other films from 2007. The CGI of Ghost Rider, which was groundbreaking when the movie premiered, looks a touch artificial through modern eyes. The digital flames don't always integrate seamlessly with the real-world elements, and there are moments where you can clearly spot the difference between computer-generated imagery and live-action footage. This isn't a knock on the effects team, who did admirable work with the technology available to them, but rather an observation about how dramatically CGI technology has advanced in the years since the movie's release. Having said all that, and having examined both the strengths and weaknesses of the movie, the question everyone's asking is Ghost Rider worth watching? And my answer is a resounding yes, but with some qualifications. If you're looking for a profound, sophisticated film that challenges your understanding of the human condition and makes you rethink your existence, Ghost Rider probably isn't the movie for you. But if you're looking for a pure entertainment experience that delivers spectacular action, charismatic characters, a fascinating premise, and 2 hours of uncomplicated fun, then Ghost Rider is exactly what you need. But let's dig even deeper, because there are aspects of this movie that warrant a more extensive examination. I want to talk about the philosophical and moral themes that underlie the story, because despite being a comic book action movie, Ghost Rider touches on themes that are surprisingly deep and relevant. The most obvious theme is free will versus fate. Johnny Blaze made a deal that apparently sealed his destiny forever. He sold his soul and became a slave to Mephistopheles. But throughout the movie, Johnny fights against that imposed destiny and eventually manages to reclaim his autonomy. The message is clear. No pact, no contract, no outside force can determine your destiny if you decide to take control of your own life. It's an empowering message that resonates beyond the supernatural context of the film. Another important theme is redemption. Johnny made a terrible mistake when he was young, a mistake with catastrophic consequences, and most of the movie is about his attempt to redeem himself for that error. Redemption doesn't come easily. Johnny has to face demons, both literal and figurative, overcome his own fears and weaknesses, and be willing to sacrifice himself for others. But in the end, redemption is possible, not through the elimination of the curse, but through the transformation of something bad into something good. Johnny doesn't break free of his chains, but turns them into weapons against injustice. And that's the most noble form of redemption there is. There's also a theme about responsibility and the consequences of our actions. Every decision Johnny makes has ripple effects that extend far beyond what he could have anticipated. His decision to sell his soul doesn't just affect his own life, but the lives of everyone around him, from his father to Roxanne, to all the innocent people caught up in the war between Mephistopheles and Blackheart. The movie reminds us that our actions have consequences, that decisions made in desperation can yield results we never imagined, and that the best way to deal with those consequences is to face them head-on, rather than running from them. And then there's the theme of good versus evil, but presented in a way that's more nuanced than it might appear. In Ghost Rider, the lines between good and evil aren't always clear-cut. Mephistopheles is the devil, yes, but his opposition to Blackheart technically benefits humanity. Blackheart is a demon, but his rebellion against his father echoes the myth of Lucifer's rebellion against God. And Johnny, while being the hero of the story, draws his powers from an evil source and uses them in ways that include extreme violence and destruction. The movie suggests that good and evil aren't absolute categories, but depend on context and the intentions behind actions, which is a more sophisticated perspective than you'd expect from a film like this. Let's spend a bit more time on the penance stare, because it's one of Ghost Rider's most fascinating and compelling powers, and it deserves a closer look. The penance stare is Ghost Rider's ability to make anyone who looks into his eyes feel all the pain they've ever caused to others throughout their entire life. It's a form of instant absolute justice that cannot be dodged or bought off. It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter how powerful you are, if Ghost Rider locks eyes with you and you've caused suffering to others, you will feel every moment of that suffering in your own flesh. What's fascinating about this power is that it's not a physical attack, but a moral one. Ghost Rider doesn't punch his victims or burn them with fire. He simply forces them to confront the consequences of their own actions. It's the purest form of justice imaginable, because there's no judge, no jury, no possibility of error, just the naked truth of what you've done and the pain you've caused. And the reaction of the penance stare's victims is always devastating. Some collapse weeping, others scream in agony, and some just freeze in place as they relive every moment of cruelty they've ever inflicted. This power raises interesting philosophical questions about the nature of justice. Is it fair to make someone suffer exactly what they've made others suffer? Is perfect reciprocity of pain a legitimate form of punishment? And more importantly, can this kind of justice lead to redemption, or does it simply perpetuate a cycle of suffering? The movie doesn't answer these questions directly, but it poses them in a way that invites reflection, which is more than you might expect from a movie that on the surface seems to be just a parade of explosions and flaming skulls. There's one scene in particular that exemplifies the power of the penance stare brilliantly. When Ghost Rider confronts a street criminal and uses the stare on him, the criminal, who seconds earlier was an arrogant and violent thug, completely falls apart. You can see the exact moment when every bit of cruelty he's inflicted on others comes flooding back to him multiplied, and his face goes from arrogance to absolute terror in a fraction of a second. It's a moment that's simultaneously satisfying and disturbing. Satisfying because you feel justice is being served, but disturbing because you realize how terrifyingly powerful and absolute this ability truly is. Now, I want to talk about the transformation itself, the physical process by which Johnny Blaze becomes Ghost Rider, because it's one of the most iconic sequences in the movie and deserves a detailed breakdown. The first transformation happens at night, which makes sense because Ghost Rider is a nocturnal creature who emerges when the sun goes down. Johnny is walking down the street when he suddenly feels a burning sensation starting in his chest and spreading throughout his entire body. The transformation is painful and violent. His skin burns and melts away to reveal the bone beneath. His skull is engulfed in flames, his eyes vanish and are replaced by empty sockets filled with fire, and his clothing morphs into a black leather jacket covered in spikes and chains. Nicolas Cage does extraordinary work conveying the agony and horror of the transformation. His screams and convulsions are convincing and visceral, and you can genuinely feel the terror of a man being consumed by a fire that's coming from inside his own body. It's as if every cell of his being is being destroyed and reconstructed simultaneously, and Cage's expression perfectly captures that sensation of extreme torment. What's also remarkable about the transformation scene is how it's filmed. Johnson uses a combination of extreme close-ups, slow motion, and intense sound effects to create a genuinely unsettling horror atmosphere. You can hear the crackling of flames, the creaking of bones, the hiss of burning flesh, and all these sounds combine to create a sensory experience that raises the hair on the back of your neck. It's a scene that proves Johnson has a real knack for horror, which makes sense considering Ghost Rider is, at his core, a horror character. After the transformation, Ghost Rider's first full reveal in all his glory is a powerful cinematic moment. The camera does a slow pan from the feet up to the head of the Spirit of Vengeance, gradually revealing the chain-covered boots, the leather pants, the spiked jacket, and finally the skull wrapped in flames. It's a presentation that knows how to build anticipation and rewards the viewer's patience with an absolutely iconic image. And when Ghost Rider looks directly at the camera for the first time, with those empty sockets burning with hellfire, it's a moment that hits you with a mix of awe and terror that perfectly defines the character. The way Ghost Rider moves also deserves mention. Unlike Johnny, who's a regular guy who walks and moves like any normal person, Ghost Rider has a way of moving that's predatory and menacing. He walks with slow, deliberate steps, turns his head in ways that seem unnatural, and carries himself with a posture that communicates power and danger at every moment. The animators and the motion capture team did excellent work creating a unique body language for Ghost Rider that clearly distinguishes him from his human alter ego. And I can't discuss the transformation without mentioning the reverse transformation, the moment Ghost Rider turns back into Johnny Blaze when the sun comes up. This transformation is different from the first one. It's quieter and less violent, as if the fire is gradually dying out and the skin and flesh are growing back over the bone. It's a process that visually resembles a plant sprouting from the earth. There's something organic and natural about the way Johnny re-emerges from the flames, as if he's being reborn from the ashes. And the expression of relief and exhaustion on Cage's face when he becomes human again is absolutely perfect. You can feel the weight of the experience in every line of his face. I want to dive deeper now into the movie's action sequences because they're a fundamental component of the experience and deserve detailed analysis. Ghost Rider's action scenes are designed to be spectacular and visually striking, and they generally deliver on that promise. The first major action sequence is the city street chase, where a freshly transformed Ghost Rider tears through the streets on his hell cycle while the police try to stop him. This chase is chaotic and exhilarating, with Ghost Rider leaving a trail of fire in his wake while patrol cars explode around him. There's one particular moment that always gets me smiling, when a police helicopter tries to follow Ghost Rider and he simply rides up the side of a building, leaving the helicopter crew completely dumbfounded. The fight against Gressel, the Earth Demon, is interesting because it's the first time Ghost Rider goes up against an opponent who can actually give him a real fight. Gressel is a formidable enemy whose decomposition power threatens to destroy Ghost Rider himself, and the battle between them has a back-and-forth rhythm that maintains tension throughout. Ghost Rider has to use his chain and his flames in creative ways to defeat Gressel, and the final result is satisfying and visually spectacular. The fight against Abagor, the Wind Demon, is probably the most dynamic of the three henchman battles because it involves a high-speed pursuit. Abagor can move at incredible speeds by turning into wind, and Ghost Rider has to push the Hell cycle to its limits to keep up. The chase takes both combatants through different environments, from city streets to the outskirts, and the constant change of scenery keeps the action feeling energetic and exciting. The fight against Wallow, the water demon, takes place in a more enclosed and claustrophobic setting, giving it a different feel compared to the other two battles. Wallow is an insidious opponent who can emerge from any liquid surface, which means Ghost Rider never knows where the next attack is coming from. The tension in this fight comes more from uncertainty than speed, and Johnson handles the suspense buildup before each of Wallow's appearances quite well. And finally, the climactic battle against Blackheart Legion is the entire movie's crescendo and the most elaborate and emotionally charged action scene. Blackheart, now supercharged with 1,000 souls, is an opponent who outclasses Ghost Rider in raw power, and the fight reflects that imbalance. Ghost Rider gets hit, knocked down, and seemingly defeated multiple times during the fight, which makes his eventual victory all the more satisfying, because you know he had to earn it through sheer determination. And the moment Ghost Rider unleashes the penance stare against Legion, channeling the agony of 1,000 sinful souls against Blackheart, is the action highlight of the entire film. Now, I want to shift focus and talk about something that doesn't get discussed much when people talk about Ghost Rider, and that's the movie's portrayal of motorcycle culture. The world of stunt riding is a fundamental part of Johnny Blaze's identity, and the movie does a solid job showing that world with respect and authenticity. The stunt show scenes are filmed with an energy and enthusiasm that convey the thrill of these performances, and you can feel the adrenaline of the jumps and acrobatics as if you were sitting right there in the stands. The motorcycle designs in the movie also deserve praise. Beyond the supernatural Hell cycle, the film showcases several real-world motorcycles that are gorgeous pieces of engineering. The chopper Johnny rides before his transformation is particularly impressive, a sleek and powerful machine that reflects its owner's personality. And there are multiple shots throughout the movie devoted simply to showcasing the beauty of these bikes, with close-ups of gleaming chrome, roaring engines, and wheels spinning at incredible speeds. It's clear the filmmakers loved motorcycles just as much as Johnny Blaze himself does. I want to talk about the humor in the movie as well, because it's an aspect that often divides opinion, but that I personally find really effective. Ghost Rider has a sense of humor that ranges from subtle to blatant, but it always works within the story's context. The most effective comedic scenes generally involve Johnny trying to cope with the consequences of being Ghost Rider in his everyday life. For instance, there's a scene where Johnny wakes up after his first night as Ghost Rider with zero memory of what happened, like he had a particularly wild night out. His confusion and disbelief when he discovers what he did are genuinely funny and add a touch of humanity to a completely supernatural situation. There's also humor in the relationship between Johnny and Mac, with Mac delivering sarcastic comments and funny observations about his friends' eccentricities. Donald Logue has excellent comedic timing, and every one of his jokes lands perfectly, providing moments of levity that balance out the more intense and darker scenes. It's the kind of humor that doesn't break tension but momentarily eases it, letting you catch your breath before the next action or suspense sequence. And then there are the more absurdist comedic touches, like Johnny's quirks, that include listening to the Carpenters while doing stunts, compulsively eating jelly beans, and watching videos of monkeys doing karate on TV. These details might seem random, but they actually serve to characterize Johnny as an eccentric, slightly maladjusted guy who uses these little oddities as emotional defense mechanisms against the constant terror he feels about his curse. It's humor with purpose, and that makes it more effective than just a random joke thrown in to get a cheap laugh. Now, I want to discuss something I think is important to contextualize, and that's Ghost Rider's place in the history of superhero cinema. Back in 2007, the superhero movie landscape was vastly different from what it is today. The Marvel Cinematic Universe didn't exist yet, Iron Man wouldn't premiere until 2008, and superhero movies were standalone productions with no connections to each other. The superhero films of that era included Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, Bryan Singer's X-Men trilogy, Christopher Nolan's Batman series, and various adaptations like Hulk, Fantastic Four, and Mark Steven Johnson's own Daredevil. Ghost Rider came out at a time when audiences were clearly hungry for superhero content, but before the MCU formula revolutionized the genre. Superhero movies of that era had more freedom to be experimental and distinct from one another. They didn't need to follow an established formula or tie into a shared universe. This meant each film could have its own tone, its own visual style, and its own interpretation of what a superhero movie could be. Ghost Rider took advantage of that freedom to create something that was truly unique, a blend of supernatural horror, Western influences, and superhero action that didn't look or feel like anything else in the genre. Viewed in the context of its era, Ghost Rider was a risky bet that paid off. Not many studios would have dared to greenlight a movie about a relatively obscure character like Ghost Rider, one who didn't have the same fan base as Spider-Man or Batman, and who had horror and supernatural elements that didn't necessarily translate to family-friendly entertainment. But Columbia Pictures backed the project, hired a first-rate cast, invested a substantial budget in special effects, and trusted that the premise was compelling enough to draw audiences, and they were right. Ghost Rider's influence on subsequent superhero cinema is subtle but real. The movie demonstrated that there was a market for adaptations of lesser-known comic book characters, and that superhero films could incorporate elements from other genres, like horror, without alienating mainstream audiences. This lesson was taken to heart by Marvel Studios when they began experimenting with different tones and genres in their own films. From the political thriller of Captain America, The Winter Soldier, to the cosmic comedy of Guardians of the Galaxy. Ghost Rider wasn't the only film that opened these doors, of course, but it was one of the ones that proved audiences were willing to embrace darker, more adult-oriented takes on the superhero genre. Let's talk now about the art direction and production design of the movie, because these are aspects that contribute enormously to creating Ghost Rider's visual world. Production designer Kirk M. Petruccelli crafted a world that merges elements of the American Southwest with Gothic and supernatural touches. The locations include dusty deserts, lonely highways, small towns, atmospheric cemeteries, and the ghost town of San Venganza. And each of these settings is designed with careful attention to detail and a clear sense of the atmosphere it's meant to create. The ghost town of San Venganza is particularly notable as a piece of production design. It's a place that looks like it was pulled from an Old West nightmare, with abandoned, deteriorated buildings, dust-covered streets, and a church that stands as the sole landmark in a landscape of desolation. The design of San Venganza evokes a sense of abandonment and malevolence that's perfect for the movie's climax. You feel like you're in a place where something terrible happened a long time ago and where evil still lurks in every corner. The costumes also play a key role in the movie's visual identity. Ghost Rider's outfit, with its black leather jacket, metallic spikes and chains, is an iconic design that's become one of the most recognizable in superhero cinema. But Johnny's civilian wardrobe is interesting too, reflecting his personality and lifestyle. Johnny dresses like a classic biker, with worn jeans, t-shirts, and leather jackets, a look that's both rebellious and approachable. Eva Mendes, as Roxanne, by contrast, dresses in a more professional and polished manner, reflecting her career as a journalist and her city life. Peter Fonda's wardrobe as Mephistopheles deserves special mention. His elegant suit and hat give him the air of a Southern gentleman from another era, like a Civil War-era plantation owner who's been alive forever. It's a wardrobe that communicates power, wealth, and timeless elegance that's perfect for a character who has existed since before the world was created. And the contrast between Mephistopheles' refinement and Ghost Rider's rawness visually reinforces the power dynamic between the two characters. Sam Elliott, as the caretaker, also has a memorable wardrobe that immediately establishes him as an Old West character who has survived into the modern world. His cowboy hat, his weathered leather jacket, and his riding boots are the clothes of a man who has lived for over a century and stayed true to his roots despite the passage of time. It's a wardrobe that tells a story without needing any words, and that's top-notch costume design. I want to address now an aspect of the movie that's often overlooked but contributes significantly to the experience: the sound design. Ghost Rider's soundscape is a crucial part of what makes the movie work, and the sound team did an excellent job creating an audio landscape that's rich, detailed, and immersive. The sound of Ghost Rider's flames, for example, isn't simply the sound of a normal fire. It's a deep, constant roar that has an almost animalistic quality, as if the flames are alive and have a will of their own. This sound is modified depending on the situation, becoming more intense and aggressive during action scenes and softer and more crackling during quieter moments. The sound of Ghost Rider's chain is another distinctive audio element. Every time Ghost Rider moves his chain, you can hear the metallic clink of the links striking against each other, a sound that's simultaneously familiar and ominous. And when Ghost Rider uses the chain as a weapon, the sound amplifies into a sharp whistle that tells you exactly how dangerous that weapon is. It's a sound detail that adds weight and realism to a weapon that could have seemed silly if it hadn't been treated with this level of care. The motorcycle sound is noteworthy too. The Hell Cycle has a roar that's different from any real motorcycle. It's deeper, more resonant, and has a supernatural quality that sets it apart from conventional bikes. And the audio transition when Johnny's normal motorcycle transforms into the Hell cycle is a fantastic sonic moment. You can hear the engine shift from a mechanical sound to something that sounds like a volcano rumbling beneath the seat. Now, I want to explore a topic I find especially compelling, which is the representation of evil in Ghost Rider. The movie presents different facets of evil through its various villains, and each one represents a different type of wickedness. Mephistopheles represents sophisticated, calculating evil, the kind of wickedness that uses intelligence and manipulation to get what it wants. He doesn't need to resort to direct violence because he has the power to deceive and corrupt people, convincing them they're getting a good deal when they're actually giving away the most valuable thing they possess. Blackheart, on the other hand, represents impulsive, ambitious evil, the kind of wickedness that wants power for power's sake, regardless of consequences. Blackheart doesn't have his father's patience or subtlety. He wants everything, and he wants it now. And he's willing to tear apart anything standing in his way to get it. It's a more direct and less sophisticated form of evil, but no less dangerous for it. The three elemental demons represent evil as a force of nature, a malevolence that has no personal motivations, but simply destroys because that's its nature, like an earthquake or a storm. They're the embodiment of chaos and destruction, and their lack of individual personality reinforces this idea that they're impersonal forces of evil rather than evil individuals. And Ghost Rider himself represents a form of evil that has been redirected toward good. The spirit of vengeance's power comes from a malevolent source. It's a curse imposed by the devil, but Johnny chooses to use that power to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. It's a fascinating idea that evil can be transformed into a tool for good if the person wielding it has the will and the moral compass to resist its corrupting influence. It's a theme that resonates with many philosophical and religious traditions that speak about the duality of good and evil and about humanity's capacity to transform darkness into light. Speaking of religious traditions, you can't ignore the heavy religious and mythological weight in Ghost Rider. The movie is packed with biblical and theological references, from the Faustian pact with the devil to the concept of a divine avenger who punishes sinners. The idea of Ghost Rider as an agent of supernatural vengeance has roots in Judeo-Christian traditions about avenging angels and divine justice, but it also incorporates elements from other mythologies and folk traditions, like the legend of the Headless Horseman and folk tales about pacts with evil spirits. The church in San Venganza, where the climax takes place, is an obvious religious symbol connecting the story to the Christian tradition of the American Southwest missions. It's a place where the sacred and the profane meet, where faith and superstition coexist, and where the final battle between good and evil literally takes place on consecrated ground. The fact that Ghost Rider fights Blackheart in a church isn't accidental. It's a visual commentary on the idea that the struggle between good and evil is waged even in the most sacred spaces. I want to take a moment to discuss the filming locations, because the movie was shot primarily in Melbourne, Australia, despite being set in the American Southwest. This kind of location substitution is common in Hollywood, where studios take advantage of tax incentives and production facilities in other countries to reduce costs. Melbourne provided both interior studios and exterior locations that, with the help of production design and visual effects, could convincingly pass as Texas and other southwestern states. It's interesting to think that the streets you see in the movie, the ones Ghost Rider tears through on his hell cycle, leaving a trail of fire, are actually Australian streets dressed up as American ones. The production team did excellent work modifying the locations to look authentically American, from store signage to the vehicles parked on the streets. It's the kind of invisible work that audiences never notice, but that's essential to maintaining the cinematic illusion. Now, I want to address something more personal and reflect on why Ghost Rider remains relevant and beloved by so many people despite its imperfections. I think the answer has to do with the authenticity of the passion behind the movie. When you watch Ghost Rider, you can feel that the people who made it genuinely loved the source material and wanted to make the best movie they could with the resources they had. This isn't a cynical production made solely to cash in. It's a labor of love from a director who knew and respected the comics, a lead actor who'd been a fan of the character since childhood, and a technical team that pushed themselves to bring the spirit of vengeance to life in a convincing and exciting way. That authenticity shows, and it's what makes the movie's fans defend it so passionately despite the negative reviews. When someone loves what they do, that love comes through the screen, and Ghost Rider is brimming with that love from the first scene to the last. It's an imperfect movie, sure, but it's a movie made with heart, and that's worth more than all the technical perfection in the world. I also want to talk about Ghost Rider's legacy and how it's influenced subsequent productions. As I mentioned earlier, the movie got a sequel in 2012, Ghost Rider, Spirit of Vengeance, directed by Neville Dean and Taylor, with a radically different visual style. The sequel received similar mixed reviews, but proved there was enough interest in the character to warrant another film. Nicolas Cage returned as Johnny Blaze, but the tone and direction of the sequel were so different, it almost felt like a reimagining of the character rather than a direct continuation. Later on, Ghost Rider appeared in the TV series Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., where he was portrayed by Gabriel Luna in his Robbie Reyes incarnation. This version of Ghost Rider was very well received by fans and demonstrated that the character could work across different formats and with different actors. And more recently, there have been constant rumors and speculation about Ghost Rider's potential appearance in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which would be a dream come true for many fans who want to see the Spirit of Vengeance interact with the Avengers and other Marvel heroes on the big screen. Ghost Rider's cultural impact extends beyond cinema as well. The image of the flaming skull has become a pop culture icon that transcends its comic book origins. You see it on T-shirts, tattoos, posters, and all kinds of merchandise. It's such a powerful and universally recognizable image that it's taken on a life of its own, separating in some ways from the specific character to become a general symbol of rebellion, power, and supernatural justice. And part of that iconic status is owed to the 2007 movie, which was the first time many people saw Ghost Rider in action and fell in love with the image and the concept. Coming back to the movie itself, I want to highlight some details and moments that I consider particularly well crafted and that are often overlooked in discussions about the film. The first is the scene where Johnny discovers for the first time that he can control the transformation. There's a moment of revelation where Johnny, in the middle of a desperate situation, manages to summon Ghost Rider voluntarily instead of waiting for the transformation to happen on its own. This moment is crucial for the character's arc because it represents the shift from victim to active agent, and Cage plays it with a quiet intensity that's very different from his more theatrical work in other scenes. It's a moment of empowerment that feels genuine and earned, not forced or contrived. Another moment I think is especially well done is the final scene between Johnny and Roxanne, where Johnny reveals the full truth about his condition and Roxanne decides to stay with him despite everything. It's an emotional scene that works because both actors play it with sincerity and vulnerability. Johnny doesn't try to minimize the gravity of his situation or make promises he can't keep, and Roxanne doesn't pretend everything is fine or that she accepts the situation without reservations. Both are honest about their fears and uncertainties, and that honesty is what makes their relationship believable and touching. The Carter Slade reveal scene also deserves recognition for its emotional and narrative impact. When the caretaker finally reveals he's the original Ghost Rider, the moment works both as a plot surprise and on an emotional level. There's something deeply moving about the idea of a man who has carried a curse for over a century and who finally finds someone he can trust to continue his mission. Sam Elliott's performance in this moment is flawless. His eyes convey a century's worth of weariness and regret that makes the revelation so much more than just a plot twist. And the scene that immediately follows, when Carter Slade transforms into the Old West Ghost Rider one last time to accompany Johnny to San Venganza, is cinematically perfect. Slade's transformation is different from Johnny's. It's slower and more solemn, as if the old cowboy is performing a sacred ritual for the very last time. His skeletal horse emerges from the shadows wreathed in blue flames, contrasting with the orange flames of Johnny's hell cycle, and the image of the two ghost riders riding together toward the horizon is one of the most beautiful and emotionally stirring shots in the entire film. The fact that Carter Slade uses his final transformation to help Johnny and then fades away, suggesting he's finally found peace after more than a century, adds a dimension of sacrifice and redemption that elevates the entire sequence. It's a moment that demonstrates Ghost Rider isn't just a spectacular action movie, but also has genuine heart and emotional depth. Let's talk a bit more about Mark Steven Johnson's direction, because I think he deserves a fairer shake than he typically gets. Johnson isn't considered one of Hollywood's elite directors, and his films have received mixed criticism throughout his career. But in Ghost Rider, Johnson demonstrates several directorial skills that are genuinely admirable. His handling of tone, while not flawless, manages to balance elements of horror, action, romance, and humor in a way that works more often than it doesn't. His direction of actors is effective, drawing believable performances even in the most fantastical situations. And his visual approach to the film, combining Old West aesthetics with modern supernatural horror, is coherent and compelling. Johnson also does good work with the overall pacing of the movie, maintaining a balance between action sequences and character development moments that allows the audience to connect emotionally with the story without getting bored during the quieter stretches. It's not a perfect directorial effort, There are questionable decisions and moments where less could have been more, but it's honest, committed work that deserves respect. One thing Johnson does particularly well is the use of iconography. Ghost Rider is packed with iconic images that stick in your memory long after the movie ends. The flaming skull reflected in a shattered mirror, the hell cycle leaping over a burning truck, Ghost Rider standing on a church rooftop with flames lighting up the night, the two Ghost Riders galloping toward the horizon, the pennant stare reflected in victims' eyes. Each of these images is a cinematic poster unto itself, a visual composition that communicates the essence of the character and the story in a way that transcends words. That ability to create iconic imagery is a skill not every director possesses, and it's one of the reasons Ghost Rider has endured in the collective memory despite its narrative shortcomings. You might forget some of the dialogue, you might forget some plot specifics, but you will never forget those images. And in a visual medium like cinema, that ability to create memorable images may be the most important skill a director can have. I want to address the question of the movie's tone as well, because it's an aspect that's generated plenty of debate among fans and critics alike. Ghost Rider has a tone that oscillates between serious and comedic, between dark and light, and this constant tonal shifting is something that some viewers find jarring. 1 minute, you're watching a genuine horror scene with demons killing people, and the next, you're laughing at Nicolas Cage's antics with jelly beans. This kind of tonal whiplash can be tricky to manage, and there are moments in the movie where the transitions aren't as smooth as they could be. However, I actually think this eclectic tone is one of the things that makes Ghost Rider unique. Superhero movies that are relentlessly serious can be exhausting, and ones that are consistently comedic can feel hollow. Ghost Rider finds a middle ground that, while imperfect,